The year was 1999. Behind closed doors at ABC's headquarters in New York, a man once considered the most fearsome puncher in boxing history sat nervously adjusting his tie. George Foreman, now 50 years old, heavyweight champion turned multimillionaire grill entrepreneur, had come with an extraordinary proposition. $23 million in cash. That was his offer to purchase and permanently seal away all footage, photographs, and documentation of the most painful night of his life. October 30th, 1974. In Kinshasa, Zaire. The night Muhammad Ali shocked the world. The night George Foreman's invincibility shattered before 80,000 screaming fans. The executives exchanged glances, stunned by both the figure and the request. How could someone seek to erase what many considered the greatest boxing match in history? What demons still haunted a man who had seemingly rebuilt his life and found redemption? Before continuing, this channel exists because of you. If you're already feeling the emotion in this story, subscribe now. It's quick, easy, and makes all the difference to me. Nobody knew about this meeting. Not Foreman's family, not his business partners, not even his closest friends. For 25 years, he had smiled through interviews about the fight, pretended the humiliation had made him stronger, claimed he had found peace. But privately, the nightmares continued. In them, he was always back in that sweltering African ring, throwing punches that somehow couldn't find their target, feeling his legendary power draining as Ali taunted him. "Is that all you got, George?" The truth was, George Foreman had built an empire selling grills and preaching gospel, but he couldn't sell himself the one thing he desperately wanted: freedom from the shadow of Muhammad Ali. "Gentlemen," Foreman said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know what you're thinking. That I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I've spent 25 years having strangers tell me about the worst night of my life. 25 years watching myself fall. 25 years hearing Ali Bomai in my sleep. I'm offering you $23 million to let me buy my peace." Michael Davis, ABC's head of archives, had prepared for many scenarios in his 15-year career, but nothing like this. He studied Foreman's face. The man looked nothing like the scowling destroyer who had terrorized the heavyweight division in the early 70s. Before him sat a grandfather, a preacher, a businessman worth hundreds of millions, yet clearly still wounded. "Mr. Foreman," Davis began carefully, "that footage doesn't just belong to ABC, it's licensed to dozens of companies worldwide. It appears in documentaries, sports compilations, historical archives. And even if we could somehow recall all official copies—" He paused, choosing his words delicately. "In the digital age, erasing history is impossible." Foreman's eyes darkened. The same eyes that had once struck terror into opponents now revealed a vulnerability few had ever witnessed. "I understand it can't disappear completely, but your archives hold the master tapes, the clearest footage, the primary source. If that's sealed away, at least the highest quality evidence fades." He leaned forward, his massive frame making the executive chair seem like doll furniture. "Did you know I never watched the fight? Not once in 25 years. I've seen clips when they ambush me with them on TV, but I've never sat down to study my own defeat. I can't." The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the weight of a legendary athlete's confession. Davis exchanged glances with the other executives. They all recognized they weren't just discussing business anymore. They were being asked to participate in the rewriting of sports history. News of the meeting leaked 2 days later. Nobody knew exactly what had transpired behind those closed doors, but rumors swirled throughout the boxing world. Sports journalists began digging, calling contacts at ABC, reaching out to Foreman's representatives. Initially, denials came from all sides. "Absolutely false," Foreman's manager stated. "George has nothing but respect for the historical significance of the Ali fight." ABC released a terse statement. We do not comment on private business discussions, but ABC remains committed to preserving important sporting events for future generations. The denials only fueled speculation. Why such carefully worded responses? Why not outright call it fiction? James Peterson, a veteran boxing journalist with 30 years covering the sport, couldn't let it go. Something about the story resonated with conversations he'd had with Foreman over the years. Moments when the jovial mask slipped, when the mention of Zaire brought a momentary shadow across the big man's face. Peterson began methodically working his contacts, promising anonymity, piecing together fragments. A receptionist who had seen Foreman enter the building, a junior executive who overheard raised voices, an accountant who mentioned unusual financial discussions. Individually, these details proved nothing. Collectively, they painted a compelling picture. Peterson took a risk and published the story in Boxing Illustrated. Foreman's Secret Fight, the $23 million offer to erase history. The article exploded across sports media. Talk shows debated the ethics of allowing historical events to be purchased and suppressed. Former boxers weighed in, some sympathetic to Foreman's alleged pain, others outraged at the notion of erasing Ali's greatest triumph. The public seemed divided, but united in their fascination. Through it all, George Foreman remained silent, cancelling scheduled appearances and retreating to his ranch in Marshall, Texas. His silence spoke volumes to those who had followed his career. The man who never met a microphone he didn't love was suddenly unavailable for comment. Muhammad Ali, battling the advanced stages of Parkinson's disease, couldn't respond directly to the controversy. His daughter Layla, herself a professional boxer, spoke instead. "My father defined himself through his victories against the greatest opponents. That night in Zaire represented everything he stood for: courage against the odds, intelligence overcoming power, an African-American man triumphing on African soil. Nobody has the right to erase that legacy, not for 23 million, not for any amount." Her words carried the moral weight that had always surrounded her father, and public opinion began shifting against Foreman. 7 days after the story broke, with pressure mounting, ABC finally issued a comprehensive statement. "While we can confirm that discussions with Mr. Foreman regarding our archival footage took place, at no point did ABC entertain any offer to restrict access to historical sporting events. The preservation of these cultural moments represents our commitment to journalistic integrity." Reading between the lines, the statement confirmed the meeting had occurred without explicitly acknowledging the offer itself. For journalists like Peterson, this was vindication enough. Something extraordinary had indeed transpired in that boardroom. The next morning, a black SUV pulled up to Peterson's modest apartment in Brooklyn. The driver, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day, delivered an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on personal stationery. "I've carried this burden long enough. Meet me tomorrow. I'll tell you everything." It was signed simply G. Included were directions to Foreman's New York hotel and a time, 6 a.m. Peterson's heart raced. After 30 years chasing stories, the biggest one of his career had just landed in his lap. He called his editor, cleared his schedule, and spent the night preparing questions, barely sleeping as adrenaline coursed through his system. What could possibly drive a man worth hundreds of millions to try buying back a piece of his past? What was the real story behind the public redemption narrative Foreman had crafted so carefully over decades? At 5:58 the following morning, Peterson knocked on the door of the presidential suite at the Four Seasons. A security guard admitted him to a spacious living area where George Foreman sat alone, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. He looked older than his 50 years, the weight of something heavy pressing down on his broad shoulders. "Thank you for coming, James," he said without turning. "I've read your work for years. You understand boxing better than most. Not just the punches, but what happens to men inside that ring, what it costs them. He finally turned, gesturing to a chair across from him. "I'm tired of running from this. It's time someone knew the truth." For the next 3 hours, George Foreman spoke without interruption, occasionally pausing to collect himself when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Peterson recorded every word, asking clarifying questions only when necessary. What emerged was a story far more complex than a simple attempt to erase an embarrassing defeat. It was a tale of identity, of a young man whose entire self-worth had been built around destructive power, of psychological wounds that fame and fortune had masked but never healed. "People think they understand what happened in Zaire," Foreman explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They think they saw a boxing match. What they actually witnessed was the death of a man. The person I had been died in that ring. For years I had defined myself through fear. Everyone feared George Foreman. Then suddenly in one night I wasn't fearsome anymore." The revelation that stunned Peterson most wasn't about the fight itself, but what came after. "I contemplated suicide," Foreman admitted, tears welling in his eyes. 3 months after returning from Africa, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, 20 stories up, and seriously considered jumping. Boxing was all I had, all I was. Without that invincibility, who was George Foreman? The comeback, the ministry, the smiling pitchman selling grills, all of it had been built atop this unhealed wound, a desperate attempt to create a new identity when the old one shattered. The 23 million wasn't about erasing history for everyone else, Foreman explained. It was about making peace with myself. I thought if I could symbolically purchase that moment, own it completely, maybe I could finally control it instead of it controlling me. Peterson's article, published a week later under the title "The Man Who Fell, George Foreman's True Zaire Story," won every major journalism award that year. It portrayed neither a villain attempting to rewrite history nor a victim deserving pity, but a complex human being wrestling with the defining moment of his life. The public response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from former athletes, military veterans, and ordinary people who recognized their own struggles with defeat in Foreman's story. Many boxing historians revised their understanding of Foreman's post-Zaire career, seeing his transformation from scowling destroyer to smiling evangelist in a new light, not as a natural evolution, but as a deliberate reinvention born from psychological necessity. Muhammad Ali, despite his limited ability to communicate, managed to convey a message through his wife. "Tell George we are forever connected. My greatest victory and his greatest lesson. Neither of us would be who we became without that night." When these words reached Foreman, something that had been tightly wound within him for decades finally began to unravel. The two men arranged to meet privately, away from cameras and reporters, at Ali's Michigan farm. No one knows exactly what transpired between them, but those close to Foreman described a profound shift in his demeanor afterward, as if a great weight had lifted from his shoulders. 3 months after Peterson's article, ABC organized a special broadcast. For the first time, George Foreman agreed to watch the complete Zaire fight footage, with commentary provided by himself and several boxing historians. Millions tuned in, expecting perhaps a marketing spectacle, but instead witnessed something profoundly human. As Foreman watched his younger self growing increasingly desperate in the ring, he provided insights not just into boxing strategy, but into his psychological state. "Look at my eyes there," he commented during the 7th round. "That's a man realizing his identity is slipping away with every punch." When the knockout finally came in the 8th round, Foreman didn't flinch or look away. He watched himself fall, nodded slowly, and simply said, "There it is, the moment that eventually made me stronger, though it took 25 years to understand that." The $23 million that Foreman had once offered to seal away history was instead donated to create the Foreman Ali Foundation, dedicated to helping former boxers with medical expenses, education, and mental health support. At the foundation's opening ceremony, with Ali present in his wheelchair, Foreman addressed the gathering. "For years, I tried to outrun that night in Zaire. I built businesses, found religion, created a whole new public persona, all to escape the man who fell in that distant ring. But running from your defeats only gives them power over you. Today, I stop running." Sports psychologists would later study what they called the Foreman phenomenon, how public figures process humiliating defeats, and the complex relationship between public and private identity in professional athletes. But for millions of ordinary people who had experienced their own falls from grace, Foreman's journey offered something more valuable than academic understanding. It provided permission to acknowledge defeat without being defined by it, to recognize that sometimes our greatest failures create the conditions for our most meaningful transformations. As Foreman himself put it in his revised autobiography, "I didn't lose myself in Zaire. I found myself there. I just wasn't ready to meet that person for another 25 years. And the ABC executives who had sat across from Foreman during that 1999 meeting could never have anticipated how their decision to decline his offer would ultimately lead to healing rather than further concealment. When interviewed years later, Michael Davis reflected, "Sometimes the thing we want most desperately, in George's case to erase that defeat, is the very thing that would prevent our growth. By preserving history intact, painful as it might be, we preserve the opportunity for wisdom." The master tapes of the Zaire fight remain in the ABC archives, now accompanied by a special addendum. The complete interview with Foreman, explaining his journey from that night to his eventual reconciliation with its reality. For those seeking to understand the true impact of the rumble in the jungle, the footage now tells two stories. Not just Ali's triumph, but Foreman's decades-long struggle and eventual transcendence. In sports documentaries, psychological textbooks, and motivational seminars, the dual narrative provides a richer understanding of what happens when legendary opponents meet in the ring. How victory and defeat ripple through lives long after the final bell, how public moments can trigger private reckonings, and how even the strongest among us must eventually face our vulnerabilities to truly move forward. If you've made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing and commenting where you're watching from. If this story truly touched you, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.